Julia, welcome to Free Your Voice.
Thank you very much.
Success. How do you define it? You have written over 60 novels, multi million in sales. Like, does the inner voice has it finally told you, like, hey, Julia, we did it. We made it.
Definitely not. I'm not sure about multi-million, but certainly over a million. The funny thing about book sales is that once you get lots of foreign rights, translations, you lose touch of how your books are doing. So I've no idea. It could be. Um, I think it's really hard in a creative career to know if you've made it. It's not like as a promotion scale where you get to be CEO or anything. One sign of success is keeping on, keeping on. So having another book contract ahead of me, having people who still return my calls, that's one sign. I think the best sort of comparison is probably it's like being an actor, that an acting career can fizzle quite quickly if you don't get another gig. And it's a bit like that being an author, that if you don't get another book published even after 60, you start to think, oh dear, it's gone off the boil. Um,
That's what goes through your mind. So how does your day begin? Like, what time does Julia wake up in the morning?
well, I now have grown up children. So back in the day when I was first a writer, my whole day was decided about, by children's school routines. But now uh, I can run my own life, which is rather wonderful. And so I try and do as much of my creative stuff in the morning. So the sort of fresh writing, I'll try and do that in the 9 till midday slot. And at some point, I will take my dog for a walk, with usually with my husband, who also works from home now. So we have this kind of like pottering moment where we go off with the dog onto the hills where I live. And that's also part of work because we talk about what we're doing. He's sort of usually in touch with my writing project. So it's like a sounding board. That's very
Hmm.
healthy. And then in the afternoon, I'll either carry on writing or I will do the more administrative things, the stuff that we don't want to get to
Part of the
do.
process.
Yeah.
Now, are you a coffee person or tea? I mean, I know you live there in the UK. Like, tea or coffee?
Well, it's very specific. It's tea in the morning and then one strong cup of coffee in the morning. So like your mid-morning slot. And yeah, that's very important. But I'll cut myself off at that point and go back to tea for the rest of the day.
And then you go
So
back to
I
tea. Now,
need
what kind
one.
of coffee do you drink?
Well, I tend to drink. I've always in the past had cappuccinos, but now, just recently, since I stood on some scales and thought, my goodness, I've reached middle age. I've now gone black coffee, and I'm really enjoying the taste, the real proper taste of coffee that you can feel when you have black coffee. So that's a new thing for me, and I'm finding a new pleasure in just pure coffee taste. And I tend to drink something which is quite strong. So in supermarkets here, you get a scale of 1 to 5, and I go for 4. So
Oh, so
quite
now
powerful.
marriage with young kids versus marriage with older kids that probably aren't living at home anymore. What's
That's
that
true.
transition been like?
Well, I feel very blessed, because you never know what life is going to throw at you. There can be illness and all sorts of problems along the way. So I'm aware of blessings, but I have genuinely enjoyed all the stages. But I must admit, this is the most delightful of them all because I've got three splendid grown up young adults who are wonderful company. We've just actually had an amazing time as a family because my youngest is working in Hong Kong for a year. We all went out to join him at Christmas and then spent a month together in New Zealand. And it felt like peak parenting for me. I thought, oh gosh, this is what it's all added up to. Because whereas when they were teenagers, they would squabble, those things on the car journey,
It's hard on
where
a marriage. I mean, especially when the kids are
yeah,
young.
and when they want to do different things, and you end up being that car parent, always ferrying them everywhere. And then if you get any issues on behavior, that adds a little bit of grit to the oyster, doesn't it? But we've gone through that. They kind of no longer our responsibility. Well, that's not true. They always are, but they've all come through great and really enjoy parenting. So, if anyone out there is, well, any people out there are going through difficult times in their raising their kids, there is kind of like light at the end of the tunnel where you get so much back. And we're in the phase before anybody started doing the grandkid thing. So we're all just enjoying relatively, oh, I'm going to jinx this, is relative plain sailing at the moment.
Now, it's interesting because you have such this joy about you. Now, your kids, were you the disciplinarian or was it your husband?
Actually, it was me,
It
which
was
you
you.
might
You were
find
mean,
hard
huh?
to believe. I was not mean. I was stern. I was the I'm very disappointed. Um, and I can pull it out. I have got that in me. Uh, so one of the things that we kind of try to do as parents is try and have rules that were like outside of us. So here would be the agreed family rules, and that was the standard up to which you try and live. So it might be something like a rota. So it's your turn to, wash the dishes or put out the rubbish or whatever it is. Try and put it outside of us. And so when you're disappointed, you're like saying, well, look at the rules. You've not done what you said you would do. Um, and it tended to be me doing that because I was with the kids more at home. And also, I suppose my husband's a bit of an old softy, and he would be the one who would get angry. So he'd occasionally have a sort of huff, but none of us took him that seriously, to be
So
honest.
he
But
was a clown, is what you were saying, like
yeah,
sent there
he
to
is.
entertain.
He tells terrible jokes. He's going to be, if we get to be grandparents, he's going to be a complete pushover of a grandparent, and I can see it coming round again with me having to be the grandma who who makes sure they don't get too many sweets. But yeah, so it was me. How about you? Are you the stern one in your
I
son?
am definitely not. I'm the well, I think my son, he said something like, Dad, you're a clown and you're sent here to Earth to entertain us. I think that's been my role.
Okay.
I'm the one that's I don't know, boys are boys, like don't get frustrated with them. But it's hard because it's this finding this balance as now we move into work because now you're shifting into your professional role and then you got to go back and forth to your personal life and finding that balance as a creative. I have to imagine you become obsessed with something that you're working on, which means you're a little bit distant at times from those around you.
Well, one of the really delightful things that I've had is that my early phase as a writer, I was writing mainly for children, and so I could share what I was doing with my children, and they were often the first audience for things.
Hmm.
It's a bit different from being a brain surgeon or a forensic accountant, because when you come home you can't really share,
Yeah.
whereas I could. So that was great, and now I'm writing for adults. um they're also, well, actually I'm not thinking of them anymore when I write at all. It's helpful not to, because with adult material you're dealing with sort of sterner, spicier stuff.
Yeah.
um but yeah, there was those moments where you get the "What's for supper? What's for dinner, mum?" When you're in the middle of something like a really emotional scene or something where you need to concentrate. That I would feel, oh, I wish I was Roald Dahl and had my shed at the end of the garden where I could just shut the door. Um, but that's a minor worry, really. And I think there is a tendency. Some writers can get a bit precious about themselves. Um, and maybe it's the mother, I don't know, it's gender stereotyping here, but maybe as a mum you're more used to kind of putting things down and going back to looking after the kids, that I just kind of did it. uh, and their needs were as important, if not more important, than what I was doing. They need to be fed. I have to remember to pack their lunch and get their sports kit ready. Those were important tasks too. So it's important to keep your feet grounded. Writing can wait, whereas a little kid can't.
So then how do you develop a self-care plan? Because the challenge, I think, for successful entrepreneurs, because that's what you are, and including too, is to have this self-care plan, to be able to give yourself permission to take care of you, or to be able to set up some sort of recipe for you.
That's so funny. It's kind of quite of an American question, that one. Self-care plan. Um, I think if you love what you're doing, that will look after you. Though, having said that, in the writing career, you get lots of rejection, inevitably. Just not everything you write is going to hit the spot. And so you have to also, part of your self care is not to put your self worth into your book. So if somebody rejects your book, don't take it as a personal attack. And so you have to protect yourself that way. And I think that's really important from anyone who's doing any work that puts them out there, be it, I don't know, photography or singing or music or whatever it is. Try and preserve your privacy. And that goes for social media. I certainly wouldn't put myself out there in a personal way. I have a professional self that I'm out there in, Facebook and Instagram and those kind of things. But it's not the inner me. And I slightly worry if I see friends putting stuff out there, which I think, that's, you should have told me that in a phone call. You probably don't want your 600 Facebook friends to know that about you. So I guess it's slightly old fashioned, but I think there is a real space for privacy, knowing boundaries and building them and keeping to them. I admire celebrities who just say, I'm not on social media, or I only do like limited social media for a purpose, because I think they're more likely to be able to hang in there for longer than those whose every emotional flutter is out there for all to see.
So it's interesting because you kind of just touched on something in that the internet lives forever.
Yeah.
What you put out there, how you respond. Now, some people don't care because they don't live in the limelight as you do. You will always be held to I guess, a higher standard, and either fair or not fair. It's just the way it is. So, how do you decide when to speak up and when to free your voice?
That's very important. And of course, you don't know, even if you think you're just Mr. or Mrs. Ordinary, you might suddenly find yourself out there. Just at the moment, we're hearing these things about the choosing of a jury in Manhattan for the Trump trial. And suddenly, an ordinary person is having their whole social media profile from the last 5, 10 years combed through. Whatever you think about the politics of it, that's really extraordinary for an ordinary person to suddenly have the whole world looking at their post last Christmas. That's tough. um, so in my own case, aware that I do have a public profile of sorts, I think quite carefully. And I actually remember, there's one little mantra I've got, which is, I went to a talk at my children's school when they were at school, talking about healthy habits for children. But there was something I took away from me, which is, would you want what you've put out there on the side of a bus going around your local area, your town, your village, whatever it is where you live? So have that in mind. Is this worthy of a side of a bus? And the other thing is, I keep away from, because I'm there as a professional, I keep away from politics that doesn't concern my own area of expertise. And I keep away from any ill mannered spats. I don't want to join in on a debate where people have forgotten their manners and are calling each other's names and being really violent. You know how quickly it escalates. Keep away from that stuff because it's toxic. So I can find ways of expressing my own view as a citizen through elections, and if I want to, I can go and help a political party or raise funds for a charity I care about or something like that. But I will try and keep away from areas of controversy, because that is just not how I roll. I don't like getting in a knockdown fight with people over things.
I just don't see how it long term will benefit oneself to be in friction with others, to continue to add to a toxic world. I mean, there's already enough tension, cultural tension, and why would we want to add to that? I mean, you go very deep. I have to imagine your philosophies and your morals and ethics at times. You look at others and you can't understand why they do and say the things they do. Because ultimately, as a parent, our goal is should be to leave this world better than the way we found it. To
Yeah.
help give back, to help guide, to help instruct. Even inside of your novels, there's always a message in there.
Yeah, I'm not consciously aware of a message as I go in. So my latest book is called The Persephone Code. I've got it here. and it's a historical thriller set in 1812. But history always has lessons for us now. And at the center of the Persephone Code is a group called the Hellfire Club. This is a real group that grew up in the 18th century. They were political radicals, but they used very edgy ways of trying to get at society. They basically had, parties which are like orgies, extreme behavior, blasphemous behavior, really trying to shake society. Benjamin Franklin, by the way, used to go to these parties. That's something you might not have known
I
about the
wasn't aware of that. Wow,
No.
we had some interesting people.
Yeah. So it was part of that project to shake up society, the society of kings and monarchs and all of that, established churches. And when I was writing it, I was thinking about how people deal with secrets, because that's what the story is about, particularly secrets which they don't want exposed to others, and the lengths people go to cover up secrets. That is actually the key to this story. And you don't have to find that behavior back in 1812. You see people doing it today. We've got a couple of political scandals running here at the moment, just in the news, about various politicians who've been caught embezzling money or trying to hide behavior which they don't want their constituents to know. And so, as an author, you do spend a lot of time thinking about how people dig themselves into these holes. But the other thing it tells you is to have, what's the word, compassion for those who get themselves there. Because as a novelist, you're sort of imagining yourself in their shoes. So while one of the problems about today's society is people aren't allowed to say, I'm sorry, I got it wrong, or
Hmm.
I'm a different person now. It's very hard for people to get back into, I suppose, being restored.
Yeah.
And the toxic culture and social media is part of that, because I think you said that once it's out there forever, and we do need a reset button, I think. And we also need to be able to say, actually, I don't know what it's like to be like, to have been in your shoes. Tell me about it.
This is something that I don't ever hear anybody at your level talk about is that we tend to not forgive. I read something in the Wall Street Journal. It was a Wall Street Journal or somewhere online recently, and it was somebody at 16 years old. He was an accomplice in a murder. So he didn't do the murder, he was an accomplice in it. And he spent 25 years in prison. And they're releasing him after 25 years. He served the minimum sentence. I imagine there's a group of people, and I'm not giving my opinion, but imagine the group of people reading that article saying he should be locked away forever. He's a threat to society forever and ever and ever. And then there's another group saying he was 16 and made a really bad decision. But if you're the family impacted, I understand forgiveness is not going to be part of the equation. So, how do we forgive? How do we? Because all of us are guilty of something that someone else would say, I would never do that. And there's different levels of crimes, obviously, that can't be compared. But it tends to be that we are very quick to attack others' wrongdoings and hold them to something for the rest of their lives, as opposed to saying, look, people make mistakes. People aren't the same over years. That's what the word potential means, isn't it? That the
Yeah.
potential, not achievements, it's what you can become.
Yeah, I mean, we've gone into really the deepest and most important water that we can go into here, haven't we? Because um, well, I start from the basis of being a person of faith, so I'm a Christian, and forgiveness is absolutely central to my faith. But what I've learned over my life is that forgiveness has two sides to it. One is forgiveness is really for it helps the person who's had the wrong done to them. If you can't let go, and if you can't go through the process, it can't be instant. It's got to be a process. That you're actually taking power over a horrible situation by letting go of that hatred and finding forgiveness. And some of the most impressive people that I've met are those who've been able to forgive others for some wrong. But that doesn't mean to say, so that's the side of the person to whom the wrong has been done. But the person who has done the wrong, they also need to feel sorry. They have to be contrite. They've got to do something, but there has to also be something they can do. So if you say, in the case of that young person who was involved in the crime, you've got nothing you can do to pay your debt to society, that person is left in a hopeless situation. Whereas if you say, okay, you've got to serve, I don't know, a 15-year stretch or whatever it is, um, at least that gives that person the chance to say, I know I've done something which is awful, but I can at least do this. I can at least serve my sentence. Doesn't mean to say that all murderers and all people involved in crime are going to feel anything near being sorry. We're not stupid, but there has to be the opportunity for the person who is changing to have something they can do, because otherwise our society is just going to get more and more bitter and unjust, because we then start punishing people beyond what is warranted by whatever they did in the first place. A young person does need a second chance.
Well said. So I imagine in uncovering this book and going through it that you had to investigate. You had to look deep into the stories. You probably had to read about prostitution and sex trafficking and illicit use of all sorts of things. Was this uncomfortable or were you able to separate yourself from it?
Uh, Not uncomfortable, because I already knew quite a lot about the period in question, and as an author, all human life is there. Um, in the case of the Hellfire Club, the there's also the fun research you can do and actually going to the places where they parted, because the book starts with the murder in the Hellfire Caves. The Hellfire Caves is a real place. My publisher, by the way, is describing this book as Dan Brown, he of the Da Vinci Code, meets Bridgerton. So if you like either of those two things, it might be the book for you. Um, the Hellfire Caves are a network of caves about 40 minutes from where I live. And they're burrowed into a hillside underneath a beautiful church. And the idea behind it is they mirror the sacred ground on top. They are the underworld beneath. And there's a kind of anti altar right underneath the religious altar in the church above. And just this thinking of people coming up with these ideas, it reminds me a bit of like the faces of a playing card, where you've got, as you hold it, you've got the king one way round and round the other. That's what they were trying to do, that sort of marrying of heaven and hell. I thought that's such a fascinating mindset. And within the dark things they were exploring, with their basically sex parties, they were also questioning social mores. Is it right to outlaw certain behaviors? In those days, of course, things like being a homosexual was outlawed. Getting divorced was almost impossible. Being adulterous was, you could get damages for it. So they had a different set of uh, social norms which were much stricter than our own. So they've got more to push against. I find it absolutely fascinating. Maybe every author has. We all have all our characters inside us, and that includes the bad sides. And I think you look for the points of contact inside you, the stuff you keep pushed down, and look for places that can, in a way, power your writing. It's not all sweetness and light in the world, and it's certainly not in my novel either.
So closing us out, what's Julia learning today?
Well, I'm surprised actually. When I started talking to you, I thought it was going to be a nice little chat about books and writing and things. But I think I'm really learning that there is a thirst in America, as there is here, to find a way of reacting to each other when we disagree that isn't toxic. And it's a real challenge that we do have to solve, because we can see societies being pushed further and further apart. So if you sitting over there can find common ground with someone like me sitting in Oxfordshire, that's a good sign, isn't it?
Thank you so much, Julia, for sharing your story on For Your Voice.
Thank you.